Hello, it's Dr. Shelley, and the name of this video, believe it or not, is White Lives Matter. Yes, and I'm designating this video to White History Month. Yes, so no, I'm not kidding. This is White Lives Matter, and it's about White History Month. Okay? Now, that being said, if you're Italian or you're Irish, this video will hit you right in your gut and make you go, wow, okay? Because it's been my experience that almost everything behind me, white people don't know about. And I'm positive Black people don't know about most of it either. So my experience has been that knowledge is power, but lately you would agree that ignorance is power. It's so powerful that they can persuade you to believe just about anything. So one of the things I always say whenever I do a video is look it up. I need you to look it up. I need you to know that whatever I tell you should be validated and verified, because if it isn't, then I'm just one more person putting out fake news, right? All right, let's get started. So here we have Tim Wise. Much of what I'm going to tell you, I would say even more than 50% of what I'm going to talk about is from that attorney, that white attorney who is an activist and has done this more than I have and has shed light on some things that most don't know. I encourage you for your homework to go ahead and go to YouTube and pop up Tim Wise. You will be shocked. In the first category of this video of White Lives Matter and White History Month, we have a saying that you might have said yourself, white folks. You probably have been either guilty of saying it or you've heard it said during the Black Lives Matter protests that all lives matter. Yes, hopefully after this you won't think that that's a good idea to say, and maybe you'll have a little bit more compassion about Black Lives Matters. You see, I've always worn this bracelet even before there was a George Floyd, and it does say Black Lives Matter, because I have a PhD and my minor was in history. My major, of course, is nursing education, but all my entire life, including junior high, I've minored in history, and it does repeat itself. So here we go. Let's look at this. All lives matter. Well, have you ever done a breast cancer walk? Have you ever done, like me every year, a colon cancer walk? Well, it's like taking that walk on behalf of colon cancer or breast cancer, and somebody saying, you guys are idiots because all cancer matters. Kind of didn't get the point, did they? No, the point was right now the focus is on colon cancer or breast cancer. We know all cancer matters, but right now we need you to focus on this. The other issue about the all lives matter statement is that when you look at Blacks and Browns, we know that we've heard that all word before. Let's give you an example of how it didn't mean us. So when you say all lives matter, we know right away you probably don't mean us. So when we hear all lives matter, we go back to when we heard all men are created equal. And we know that that was bullshit. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson was just on some trash because he owned slaves, so that was literally crazy. And rumor has it, he may have even had a child with a slave. I don't know, I wasn't there, but I do know that he owned slaves. And I do know that the whole all lives are created equal was bullshit. The next all that Black and Brown have heard all our lives is that liberty and justice for all. Well, half my board will share with you that there certainly has not been justice for all. And liberty, oh, don't make me throw up in my mouth, as I always say. Then, so we have the Constitution where all men were created equal, and we knew that didn't apply to us. We have the Pledge of Allegiance, which is liberty and justice for all, which we knew did not apply to us. Even the national anthem, if you look it up, started out as a very racist song. Look up national anthem complete song. Look it up. The Statue of Liberty, we've always learned in school, it was to encourage people from other countries to come on over to America. We're welcoming you. We welcome the masses. It's not quite true. It was actually a gift from France to celebrate the end of slavery. And there were literally chains to demonstrate slavery in the hands of this statue, and it was redone to just put the chains by the feet, barely noticeable. But if you go today or look it up, you'll see the chains representing slavery right by the feet. Okay, now let's talk about that whole White History Month. White people may or may not know that racism as a construct in America didn't start with Black people in America. No, it actually was alive and well with Irish and Italian Americans. The Irish Americans were discriminated against, and they were seen as sinful, savages, alcoholics, not spiritual enough. They were considered uneducated, very violent. In fact, remember the phrase fighting Irish. The Irish were called white trash, and many times the Blacks and the Irish lived together. They weren't necessarily friends, but they lived comfortably together. During this time, it was the 1840s to 1860s. But then we know that divide and conquer was really, really, really important if we wanted to continue oppressing free labor called slaves. And so we saw in this country that a lot of the Irish were made to be the overseers. They were some of the slave catchers because they lived among them. And so this was like, close proximity and the whole nine. Okay, so that was your Irish discrimination. The next group of immigrants who was discriminated against was the Italians. They were called the Negro. Imagine. See, Negro, the word means black. And their skin was darker. So here we're seeing racial discrimination, right? Their skin was darker. It was said that they had that kinky hair, similar to the American Negro, or the slaves, as the case may be. They were separated from, based on where in Italy they were born. So the northern Italians were superior to the southern Italians. In the 1880s to 1920s, when they came to the U.S., there was about 4 million that immigrated to the United States. They fulfilled a purpose, blue collar work, laborers, right? Laborers. So they were allowed to be laborers, but pretty much nothing else because they were totally trashed, right? So it was so bad that they were lynched just like blacks were. Swear to God, look it up. They were lynched. In fact, there was a huge killing and massacre of Italians in New Orleans. They were discriminated against in every kind of way imaginable. And so it wasn't until this huge, ridiculous massacre in New Orleans, which took place in the, I think it was 1918 or something like that, that they were given as a consolation prize Columbus Day to celebrate, which is when they began to be seen as white. Now, before all that, they lived in little ghettos with blacks. In fact, they were friendly with blacks, which was another reason why they were discriminated against, because how dare you associate with blacks? And because they associated with blacks, they were called dirty. What's really crazy is the areas where they live were called Little Italy. We have a similar neighborhood in Ohio, in my area of Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. And they turned around in this Little Italy area, and in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, you as a black person caught in Little Italy, especially during sundown time, would be killed and lynched. Lynched, killed, stabbed, shot, whatever. But most likely you were going to be beat to death if you were caught in Little Italy. To be specific for my Cleveland folks, it was called Murray Hill. You know this. But isn't it interesting that the racism really started with them? It's sort of like, I don't know, domestic violence. If you grow up in domestic violence, very often as an adult, you might repeat it. If you grow up in racism, very likely you might repeat it. You see, racism is learned. White history. Let's move on, shall we? The next category of white history is World War II era government programs. The FHA, Federal Housing Act, the VA, Veterans Administration, and the GI Bill. Now, those VA and GI Bill are going to be used interchangeably, but those programs were targeting the veterans who came home from World War II. Because when veterans came home in the 1940s from World War II, finding affordable and appropriate housing was really hard to do. And so there was a need to have housing like there is now. And so the first thing that happened was CMHA developed what's called projects. Now, people are very shocked to learn that projects, which we call projects, which is public housing, but we call it projects. Projects were for the whites. Blacks could not move in them, and they were for only white people, because we still had a really huge amount of discrimination going on and segregation. So there was these projects, or CMHA housing. It doesn't have to be CMHA because that's just for Cuyahoga County or Cleveland. But it was federalized housing, okay? So it was governmental housing that was targeting these veterans coming home from the war. Now you have to remember that 1.2 million veterans were black at that time. We represented 10% of the armed forces. So when we came back from World War II, we didn't have these projects to go to. It's ironic now because they're all black now. Let's find out how they became all black. The government passed a VA GI Bill, and it has been amazing even now. It's helped my children. So this VA bill, or the GI Bill, gave free college, affordable home loans with low interest rates, easy credit approval. Back in the day when this was passed, you used to need more than 50% upfront to get a house. When this bill was passed, it allowed you to have either no or low down payments. It also allowed for loans for businesses and farms. It really was amazing in the sense that it gave you a whole year of unemployment benefits. Yeah, when you get out of the military and you have now been awarded this GI Bill, these were your rights. These were things that you earned and you were entitled to, unless you were black. White history. This was the beginning of the middle class as we know it. This was the beginning of suburbs. So when the military veterans came home, they were originally in these really nice, newly built, clean, beautiful project housing and government built. And then as the government started addressing the needs of our veterans, which was good, it passed the Federal Housing Administration Act and the VA/GI Bill. And that began the mass movement out of the projects and into the suburbs and into private home ownership. There was nothing left for the projects at that point but Black people. Now you know why they're usually Black. Not always, Black and brown, but I'm saying finding a white project is rare. Okay, so white history. Now, when we look back and look at the GI Bill, we looked at one year in particular in New Jersey and New York. This GI Bill showed, because again, discrimination and racism and segregation existed and thrived. And even though you think of the South, you have to remember the North was really no better. It was just more hidden. Okay, so what we found is that Black people were not getting any parts of this GI Bill. In fact, here's the statistics that year. For the 67,000 GI Bill mortgages that were given in New York and New Jersey during that year, less than 100 were given to Black people. Now you have to think, okay, for the people that actually got those homes during that time, the majority white, 99% were white. That home that they now are paying their mortgage on and owning was going to be used as a starter home to get an even bigger house later. So they're building wealth at that point. 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and on and on and on, because these mortgages were like 30-year mortgages. If they got loans to build businesses, now they're really doing great, and even farms. But again, Blacks weren't privy to this. What made it worse is that when the bill was passed, when this law and this bill was passed, they had to compromise when they're making the law and say that even though it was a federal act, it could be administered through the states. You know, states' rights. So guess what? 79% of Black people at this time that lived in America lived in the South. So of course, if 79% of people, of Black people in America, if 79% of them lived in the South and the GI Bill is state administered, then of course, they're not going to get any of this. Yeah, because what Southern state did you know that was going to give these people a GI Bill? So we're seeing a loss of what? Wealth, potential income, housing, appreciations, systematic. You see where we're going with this? Yeah, you used to say we're playing the race card. You didn't understand systematic racism. I'm going to help you. It is really profound. Okay? Redlining. Redlining, I think most people know about, but I'm not going to assume. So let's just explain it. Redlining, which was taking place in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and some 90s, that was where it was legal for bankers to take big, huge maps, and they could put them on the wall at the bank. And they would take these big, huge maps of neighborhoods, and they would draw a red line around predominantly Black neighborhoods. And as loans were given for cars and homes and businesses, the red line bordered neighborhoods did not get those loans. So there weren't going to be any home loans in that area, no car loans in that area, no business loans in that area. And so you quickly started developing what we call ghettos, urban flight, or I should say urban blight, okay? Black neighborhoods, okay? Now, when you're not able to get loans or funding for whatever projects you want, including businesses in the community, but people outside of the community can come in and get businesses for the community. Maybe you're thinking Arabic people, or we used to say Arabs back in the day because we didn't know any better. Or even Chinese food restaurants where they have, I remember seeing a video on TikTok someone sent me where the Chinese were explaining how they were not allowed to put their Chinese food restaurants in white neighborhoods, but they could get loans to put them in black neighborhoods. And then they were trying to divide and conquer us because if Chinese people came and could get businesses, but we couldn't get any kind of funding to open businesses, there was going to be resentment. The divide and conquer thing's been around for a while. So we have now all of this nonsense legally happening, and we now have an issue where as the neighborhoods go down in quality, because, you know, there's like literally a red line around the neighborhood, calling it low housing property values. You know, just the red line meant that your property wasn't going to be valued as well as the property outside the red line. And so if you know anything about school districts, you may remember property taxes really fund the schools to a bigger extent than the Department of Education on the federal level. And so if your housing value is going down, then your property taxes are going down, and the funding for your schools is going down, and the quality of your school district is going down. So now we see segregation, right? We see separate and definitely not equal in these neighborhoods, the suburbs, the urban areas, the ghetto. You got it? Now, this is how all of this developed. It's very important that you kind of roll with your girl. There was another white history legal act that was happening and still happens. I, having been a city council person, I know all about eminent domain. Eminent domain means that for the public good, they could just take your house. They could declare it condemned. They could declare it a nuisance. They could declare it as a blight in the neighborhood. They could declare it whatever they wanted and take your house. And it's important to know that 20% of Black property was taken this way by city or municipal governments. Probably one of the most famous properties that were taken this way, which just got rectified in 2022, it was taken in 1912. Yeah, you did the math, right? Because I failed math and I can even do this. It's 90 years later. But one of the most popular places where the whole entire property, acres and acres of beachfront property, taken from Blacks, called Bruce's Beachfront Property out there in LA, California. And this property was taken because what happened was Blacks were not allowed at the beach. They weren't allowed in most areas on the beach. And some women, Bruce family, got together, women, and bought this property, got their money together and bought this property. And it was their own private beachfront property since they were not allowed to go to the regular beachfront property. And they started getting attacked and violence and, you know, all this nonsense, but they held strong. They united, tried to hold on to their property. And so the people that didn't want them there, the white folks that didn't want them there, they went to the government and said, let's take it. And they did. But here's the thing. All of this was discovered during the George Floyd Black Lives Matters marches. During that time, it was found that, wait a minute, are you saying that we used to own the family, that we used to own all this property and they took it from us? Well, let's see if we can get it back. And because businesses, Target, corporations, municipalities and governments were starting to feel so bad about the whole George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement and trying to show each other how pro-Black they were. Remember that? They were successful at getting their property back. Now, they got the property back, and here's the deal. Like I said, appreciation. They were able to sell it for $30 million. Now, they should have gotten the property and the appreciation back. They didn't. But at least they got the property back. This was land-shaking, earth-quaking, amazing. And it was the first time we actually saw such a very, very valuable piece of property returned to Blacks. But that set us up for what we're dealing with now, so stay tuned. The other issue with eminent domain is that they can take neighborhoods and let factories and industries move in and pollute like crazy. They can take homes out and put freeways and expressways all the way through, causing pollution to go up and poisons and toxins to go up, lead poisoning. We know that with Cancer Alley down in Louisiana. They could take your property for malls. They could take all your property, hello, Cleveland Clinic, for hospitals. They could do whatever they wanted to do with eminent domain. Next on the list is education. So in white history, we know that with education, we have the GI Bill. And the GI Bill allowed for not just free college for the veteran, but for the whole family. The kids, they could use the bill as well. Now, we started seeing, again, the beginning of the middle class with whites going to college and even trade schools or vocational programs, either one, it doesn't matter. They were going to all that stuff. And we started seeing, again, the rise and the growth of the middle class. However, Blacks weren't really taking part in a lot of this yet because we still had our Jim Crow South. And our Jim Crow South, there was no higher learning institutions for Blacks, which was really why the birth of HBCUs is so important. Historically Black colleges and universities. It was at that time that historically Black colleges and universities started to proliferate, and they were very crowded. They were small, they were hot, they were cold in the winter. I mean, it was really, they struggled because they didn't get the funding that other schools did. And then during the 80s, it started in California with Ronald Reagan as governor. He started saying, well, you know, I don't want all these people to be going to college, because if we let all these people go to college, particularly Black and brown, who's going to be doing just the regular laboring work, right? So he decided to stop the free college that used to exist in California and started charging, making sure that the colleges started charging for education. And why does that matter? Well, because when he became president, he did the same thing. And I remember it like it was yesterday because I was in school. So during the Reagan years in the presidency, he got rid of a lot of the grants, a lot of the federal grants. We used to have federal grants to go to school. We had the state, and then we had the federal grants, and it was based on your income, and you could go to college. I did with those grants, so I know what I'm talking about. And he got rid of those and said, we'll get you a student loan. So student loan proliferation was a Reagan issue. And then because he contracted with the different colleges and allowed and encouraged them to charge so that everybody can't afford it, because we don't want everybody going to college, you saw a lot of Black and brown that couldn't afford to go. And if they did, they were sandwiched with student loan debt. Starting to make sense? So even today, the majority of student loan debt is Black and brown folks, which is why Cheeto Puff and the GOP didn't want it forgiven. Now, let's look at another issue. Let's look at high schools and junior high schools. I even remember this for myself as well as my kid. I was always the only Black in honors courses. It was a teacher that suggested that I take honors courses. My parents didn't know anything about advanced placement or honors courses. And I did get straight A's all through high school before dropping out pregnant, as y'all know. So when I was in school and I was taking honors courses, I didn't even know, as I navigated through those honors courses, European history, American history, all these histories that now form the foundation of what I'm telling you, I had no idea that those high school classes could go towards college credit, decreasing the cost of college for kids that take them. And most parents didn't know that. But here's the thing, even if Black parents knew that, Black and brown, we know that the majority of advanced placement and honors courses are usually given to white students. So with white history, they now have an upper hand when applying to colleges, as well as making sure that once they do apply to the college, they use that credit, they can decrease their tuition bill. So this is just the whole knowledge is power. But when my children were born, because of that knowledge, I remember saying to the teachers, what do you think about my daughter taking honors courses? And this, again, this is now in the 1990s. Well, I mean, yeah, I guess. Well, I'm going to meet with some people and talk about it. But then I found a little loophole. The loophole, because I was active in my community and I knew the school board laws and the different laws that affect school, I saw a loophole that said if a parent wants their child to take advanced placement classes, honors courses, they can override all of that, which is what I did. So of course my kid, you know the story. So I know that parents don't know this, and this is kind of like a big deal because it hit right at home. Also, there's this dual enrollment program that is really nice. That's where you enroll in high school, but you also enroll in a community college, and you get to take some of your classes at the community college and get college credits for it. So this is the education, all right? Now let's move over to healthcare and white history, where healthcare is concerned. When the New Deal was created, the policy was Medicare. One of the policies during the New Deal under President Roosevelt was Medicare and Social Security. They're trying to destroy it now. Remember, your little Elmo guy called it a Ponzi scheme? Well, when it happened that way, where the New Deal had these policies that were created to help the elderly, the only way it got through the Congress was all this compromising, sort of like we talked about with the GI Bill. And one of the compromises was that, okay, fine, if we pass this, then we're going to make sure that it's not necessarily going to be given to Blacks, right? So what we saw during healthcare in these years was segregated hospitals. It wasn't until the 1964 Civil Rights Act that the law included that if a hospital accepted Medicare, they had to accept Black and brown, specifically Blacks. So then we started seeing segregated hospitals. But if you live right here in Cleveland, you may remember growing up hearing county hospital. That's Metro Health Medical Center, because it was county funded and had to go by the county laws, which means that's where Black people went. I myself tried to go to the Cleveland Clinic as a very young person. I think I was 19, and I had been referred there for dermatology, and I was treated like crap by the person that's working the desk. So the receptionist called my name loudly and rudely, and I walked up to the desk. "Why are you here? How did you even get here?" I said, "I'm sorry. What? How did you get an appointment here? Who sent you here?" And I said, "I got a referral because of dermatology. I have all this skin stuff going." "Oh, well, we don't take welfare here," because at the time I was on Medicaid. I felt so disgusted and trashed that I vowed never to work for the Cleveland Clinic when I became a nurse. Guess where I work, guys? The Cleveland Clinic, right? So, I mean, what the hell is that about? You grow, you know. So when we look at the segregation of the hospitals, we know that the hospitals that were segregated were definitely not equal, and they were substandard, right? We know that Black nurses and doctors gave the best they could, but they didn't get the funding. They didn't get the same level of instruments and tools and medical equipment. You already know that. I don't have to tell you that. Now, here's what's funny. In today, we know, and I just shared it last month with my students, we know that there is still a lot of this stuff going on, in particularly the disparities in organ transplants. I shared that with my students last week, or 2 weeks ago, maybe now. I showed them where fairness in organ transplant is compromised, and that white males and Asians, according to the New York Times article, were more likely to get the organs than Blacks. So that is just the latest. Now, when we look at NIH, National Institutes of Health funding, which, go figure, Cheeto Puff cut it out anyway. But when we look at their funding priorities, I look at two diseases because they're very similar, except who they affect. Cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia. Both cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia are genetic diseases. Both parents must have the trait for the child to have the disease. They're genetic. Cystic fibrosis primarily affects Caucasians, not exclusively, but primarily. Sickle cell primarily affects Blacks, not exclusively, but primarily. The funding priorities have been poured into cystic fibrosis, hardly any in sickle cell. Just an example of disparities and white history. Maternal newborn morbidity and mortality. Morbidity means disease, mortality means death. So when we look at maternal and newborn morbidity and mortality, we know it's very much 3 to 4 times higher in the African American race, as well as Latinos. We know that if we take away poverty and some of the things that normally make a difference into what kind of quality care do you get, we know that we still outnumber whites in terms of dying from childbirth or our child dying. And so this is just more disparities. When it comes to how we're just treated, right? Just how are we treated? Very often we're determined to be, especially with sickle cell, drug seeking, looking for drugs, even though sickle cell happens to be one of the most painful conditions on earth next to pancreatitis. Nurses don't know any better. They assume you want drugs because the drugs required to take the pain away of sickle cell is some pretty strong narcotic drugs. So as we move through this list and we look at this side of the board with this list, we have a whole new section of white history and white lives matter. So I hope you're still with me, because Without you, we can't change any of this. So let's look at this. Under number 7, law enforcement. When we look at white history, we know that in terms of the history of law enforcement, the first law enforcer was the overseer. There weren't any real policemen that much. Nah, there was an overseer for black slaves. And I already told you that came a lot of times from the Irish population because they were seen as people who mixed with blacks, and this overseer business was beneath them. And also slave patrollers, which slave patrollers, again, were usually Irish, and they were there to find us, capture us, and send us back. Now, they could have one of those little rules where the person who owned us said, dead or alive, I don't care. So this is the black person's image of policemen. These overseers and slave patrollers very soon became officers or police that enforced the Jim Crow laws. You would very often see whites only, police enforcement on the bottom of the sign. Blacks only, police enforcement right at the bottom of the sign. So our image of police being a friend took a while. When you look at more issues of law enforcement, you need to look at the 1980 War on Drugs, which we're going to look at closely down here. But it was the 1980 War on Drugs that was responsible for mass incarceration and what we call the new Jim Crow. You just have to look at some of the movies that have been on Netflix that are true stories. I have my students watch them. One is called Kalief Browder, held in solitary confinement for 300 some days, put in jail for 3 days for stealing a book bag that he never stole, and how he was in this incarcerated type thing in Rikers prison for, like, seriously, adults, okay, and adolescents, both, okay. Then the Central Park 5, a bunch of 8th and 9th graders who, you know, they were literally coerced to give a confession. And we know their story. They never did it. They were kids, okay? Then we have the most recent example of law enforcement not being a friend of blacks, but white history needs to be aware of how this is being used to kind of work against blacks. We just were blessed that black people in Louisiana, 30% black, realized their power and voted down all 4 constitutional amendments, one of which was to try children 14 and older as adults. Law enforcement. We know that during 2004 and 2012, which Kalief Browder's situation was from, we know that during this time there was something called stop and frisk, and 84% of the stops were black people, and many of them were just thrown in jail for little or no reason. We know that. So black and brown were 84% of the stops, and we know that we had like literally mass fear in neighborhoods where you just could be stopped for any reason at all. Mayor Bloomberg, who tried to run for president, and I made sure I put video after video after video out because a lot of black people were supportive of Mayor Bloomberg running for president. And I said, this was the stop and frisk guy, you idiots. This guy here, if you don't know your history, it repeats, but this was the stop and frisk guy. And so this was the Central Park 5 guy who didn't want to even give them any money after it was proven that they were innocent. He kept blocking their court case. History matters. Mayor Giuliani, very supportive of stop and frisk. Cheeto Puff, very supportive of stop and frisk. He's recorded on all kinds of videos supporting stop and frisk. I have a sneaky suspicion it's coming back to us in America in 2025. Project 2025. Yeah. Okay. Now, so you have all this going on. You have quotas. Police are given, even now, quotas for stopping a number of blacks and browns. What, how many did you stop? Well, that's not enough. This whole stop and frisk was proven unconstitutional. And so it began the beginning of body camera laws. What's funny is a lot of these police officers get away with not turning it on, showing exactly what they did until after it's done. Or we, with cell phones, capture it on video and the person still gets off. The police never have to serve time. I was like a little shocked when George Floyd's cops got, convicted. Kind of shocking. Like, oh, wow, that's cool. 2025, this year, the Mississippi Police Department was convicted and sentenced. They were called the Goon Squad. There were 6 white officers who tortured these black men. Someone white called the police and said, I think there's some black guys over there. They broke in the house, tortured the men, beat the crap out of them, sexually assaulted them. Look it up, Mississippi Goon Squad. And then they took the one and put the gun in his mouth and shot straight through his mouth. He lived. It was such overwhelming evidence, something that never happens in the history of law enforcement actually happened. They all pleaded guilty. What? Police pleading guilty? Shut up. Go somewhere. Okay, so, it's crazy. We have in 2025, the Cheeto Puff president getting rid of the bad cop national registry that follows the cop if they try to get a job somewhere else. Not going to happen because you are part of this bad cop registry. Well, he got rid of that. You can go wherever you want and work wherever you want, bad cops. There is in 2025, the Antioch Police Department right near San Francisco in California. They were found guilty of falsification of police reports, which, by the way, happens all the time on blacks and browns. They were famous for all the text messages saying how they were going to kill and beat up black people and calling them names and monkeys and apes and I'd just bury them in my backyard and all this nonsense. That was the Antioch Police Department in 2025. There is such a thing as I told my family to be careful, and I told anybody who is looking at the Black Survival Tips, be careful of those blue light towns. These are towns, Willoughby, Mentor, a couple of them, lots of them, anywhere they could be, really, these houses. And there's nothing wrong with it except it's collectively not good if you see a lot. And there's a blue light on the outside of the house. That is Blue Lives Matter friendly. Lincoln Heights, Ohio. You may or may not know that this is an African-American neighborhood where the KKK, neo-Nazis, they changed the name just to keep you confused. But they're KKK to me because I'm old school. But the KKK decided to march in Lincoln Heights. Well, they were met up with some people that were black that were not our ancestors. And so they was about to get to business. And then the cops, law enforcement, helped them out a little bit. They gave the KKK a friendly escort out of the town to keep them safe. Okay, all right. Now, law enforcement again, white history. Law enforcement again. You think about how so many black men and women, but for sure black and brown men, are shot and they're unarmed. like they're running away from a crime or whatever, supposedly, and they're unarmed. Many of them are shot in their back as they're running, so you know what was going on. And they never find a gun. Some they shoot and there was a gun. But the main thing that's blowing my mind and a lot of Black people's mind is, how does law enforcement justify shooting us as we run away from them, but taking the South Carolina church shooter that killed 9 Black people in a church as they were praying and inviting him to feel free to pray among them? How does it reconcile in our minds that they thought it was a great idea to take him to Burger King? They arrested him peacefully like they do a lot of the school shooters. And then they just nicely took him to Burger King. That boy was hungry. These are the things that we can't reconcile in our minds. One more juicy bit of tidbit, if you want, for enforcement is this whole notion that, well, Blacks kill more Blacks than police officers kill Black. And there was this phrase that developed called Black on Black crime. And even Black people were all adopting this same thing. Well, it's a bunch of bullshit because, frankly, white on white crime is higher. And then the whole white on white crime, if you want to put it in a profile like you did Black on Black crime, we could say school shooters are white on white crime. But you see, we don't get labels like that for white people because white lives matter and they don't tend to do that. The media will show pictures of Blacks, profile pictures of Black, and give names. And they will just talk about the white criminals or offenders, and they will not show their faces. I remember writing a letter to Channel 3 for that purpose. I said, you know what? You gave 4 criminal news stories this morning, and all 4 were white except for one. I don't know what they look like, but the one Black, you showed their face. You never showed the faces of this person, that person, and the other. It's up to all of us to call this out because it's a bias in the media. Okay. Now, the war on drugs. White Lives Matter, White History Month. Here we go. The war on drugs, right around 1986 was Reagan. Although Nixon started with the whole war on drugs, mentality. A lot of this was part of the Southern strategy to win elections and basically oppress Blacks and Browns, to put them in jail so they can't vote and all the rest. Okay, so let's look at the war on drugs. 1986 under Reagan. Don't get it twisted. Democrats had their role to play. Clinton, whole bunch of people played a role. And to be honest with you, if you were Black and you were alive during that time, you were scared to death as well, and you wanted something done in terms of law enforcement. And what people just don't get is when you're getting robbed and you're getting killed and you're getting all this theft and burglary going around in your neighborhoods because of drugs, people trying to get money for drugs, you are desperate for law enforcement, and you are just as supportive of harsh harsh sentencing, harsh criminal, sometimes I feel like whites get blamed for it all, but there was a significant amount of Black folks in America that wanted this to stop by any means necessary. So you kind of got to go with the times, okay? So let's look on this war on drugs. Let's look at 2022 for the war on drugs way back in the 1980s, because those laws started back then. There was a big difference made between crack versus cocaine. They're the same thing, but there was a big difference made, and that difference that was made meant Blacks were arrested more often and served and given longer sentences. Because the minimum sentencing guideline, which is what I was saying, the minimum sentencing guideline was 5 years in jail for crack possession, okay? So during this 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, well, really 1980s and 1990s, there was a jail instead of drug treatment type of approach. They were not interested in giving anybody any drug treatment, at least not blacks and browns. In fact, get this, Reagan hired staff to publicize crack babies, crack mamas, and crack dealers, because that way he can get white Democrats on board with Republicans and oppressing black vote and getting them to get arrested and lose their right to vote. Because remember, once you catch a case, and here with this war on drugs, I want you to hear me now, white history, with the war on drugs, 80% of black men in prison were in there from drugs, drug charges. And half of the men in the United States are now sitting here with felons because of it. So 80% of black men were in prison with drug charges. Half of the black men in the United States have felons from those days. Now remember, there's somebody named Matt Gaetz. Remember him? He was going to be your attorney general. And when the report came out about him, the inspector general report, it talked about cocaine all the way through it and, sleeping with teenage women. Is he in jail? Does he have a minimum 5-year sentence? Did they even press charges? Did they turn it over to the Justice Department? Did any of this stuff happen? So it's just a perfect example of how white lives matter. All right, now we have, because of all of this imprisonment, we have the new Jim Crow. And remember, I didn't come up with that phrase. This is Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow. That is a very good book, white folks, if you want to read it, black folks, if you have it. And what happens is crystal meth, benzodiazepines, OxyContin, all of this started proliferating and going crazy. And there were a lot of these people that were using all this were white. So now we are starting to be more empathetic, sympathetic. Let's get them in treatment. It turns out jail may not be appropriate, but we as black people did not get that benefit of that doubt. White lives mattered. Okay? Now, once you catch a case and you become a felon, half the black men in the United States, once you catch that case, your ability to vote is no longer able in some states. You're not allowed to serve on a jury. You are turned down for housing still. You don't qualify for college grants and loans. You know you're not about to get hired. They did an interesting study. They showed that black people with a criminal background, even misdemeanor, were not going to get hired at all, but that white people with a felon or criminal background, convicted of a crime, were more likely to get hired over black people without any crime history at all, without any convictions or misdemeanors or felonies at all. We know that because he's sitting in the White House. We know that. Now, when we look at 2005, we now see, and this is still the war on drugs, when we look in 2005, we notice that 4 out of 5 drug arrests were actually for possession, not selling. So these people caught cases for just possession. And 80% of those people that possessed, that got convicted, the possession was marijuana. The stuff that's legal in a lot of states today, but not on the federal level. Yeah. Now, let's look at gun laws. Did you know that long guns can legally be shot by kids in hunting or whatever? The whatever is the key. They can be shot by children as long as the parents are around. So there's that. And Jacob Blake, I don't know if you remember him. But because of the gun laws in the state and the open carry, and it's okay for the white male to have that gun, Jacob Blake was that young man who literally went to the Black Lives Matter protest, and he carried his gun openly and outwardly, and there's video of him walking right by the police after he's literally shot someone. Not only was he not convicted, I think he was found not guilty or whatever it is. You'll have to check me on that, but I do believe that's true. But he was invited to Mar-a-Lago to meet Trump. Isn't that sweet? Now, unarmed black men like Ahmaud Arbery can be stopped by armed white men and not even charges brought against them until it was discovered months later that this even happened, and a big uproar in the community took place. But before that, these men were fine. They weren't going to charge them with anything. Remember that. Look it up. Ahmaud Arbery. That case happened months before any of it hit the public. When it hit the media, because of George Floyd, that's when everything went crazy. And they had to be charged. Now, armed black men. Philando Castile, remember him? He was driving, got pulled over by the police. His girlfriend and his child were in the back. His girlfriend sitting right next to him. He was complying with everything. The police officer asked him for his driver's license and registration. He told the police officer that he has a gun. Legally has a gun, and he reached for the glove compartment, and that police blew his brains out and killed him. You see, here's the thing. This whole open carry, gun laws, really it's for whites. I need a gun. I feel like everybody black needs a gun at this point, and I was anti-gun for most of my adult life. But what I'm seeing now, right now, I know we need a gun for protection, but it's a mixed bag. Because here's what I bet I could challenge you on. It's more homework, white folks. A lot of times when the police kill someone black, they will talk about how they chased them for God knows how long. Yes, they shot them in their back while they were running, but upon searching, there was a gun in the car. There was a gun in his coat. There was a gun found, whatever. They never say whether that person had the legal right to carry. But what they do when they say a gun was found in the car, a gun was found on this person, a gun was found nearby the body, is they let you to believe that there's a justification to kill him. Because after all, he had a gun. But I thought you had open carry and gun laws that were fine. Guns were fine if you had the legal right to carry one. So why is that being thrown up in all of these police shootings? Because it makes you feel like there's justification to kill them. I need you to watch that. Every time it happens, I want you to go, wait a minute. They said a gun was found, but they didn't say whether he had a right to carry one, and it was a legal weapon for him to carry. They never do. Pay attention to that. White lives matter. Now, 10, and the last one, and you've been really patient because it's over an hour of White Lives Matter and White History Month. So here we go. Evil by a new name is still the same. We used to call people with hoods that marched and said white racist things the KKK. Everybody knew what that was. Nobody was in doubt. We all got it. But as we move through these different years and decades, look at what's happening. The KKK is now called neo-Nazi. And Nazi is interesting because it really is, when you think of Nazi, you think of Jewish people. So it's like, well, are black people even the target, right? Okay. If we don't say that, then we say white supremacists. Okay, well, it kind of makes sense. Or Lately, it's been called domestic terrorists, but there's no laws to help us arrest the domestic terrorists, right? Like, what is that? That's too fancy, right? You're diluting the KKK is what I'm going for right now. Now we say even the far right activists. Oh, wow, now they're right. And then here, the best of all, because Cheeto Puff was proud to say he belonged in that club, white Christian nationalists. You just put Christian on there. So you just got a bunch more people ready to join that whole group of white supremacy. Understand that this is a deliberate dilution of terms so that it's more and more acceptable to oppress Black and brown. But it gets better. It gets better. You see, there were three actions or three events that really drove white folks crazy and made the bad white people want to take progressive action and work towards developing a whole project, Project 2025, to suppress and oppress Black and brown. And they did it very, very deliberately, methodically, and for some, very sneakily. Those three events was the election of President Barack Obama twice. This was the start of the Tea Party. Remember that? Then you have Black Lives Matter protests. That was big because the whole world was in on that. And then you started having corporations and companies join into the activism, saying what all they were going to do to help Blacks. You had Nike, you had the kneeling of the football players. You had all of this pro-activism because of George Floyd being killed the way he was. But then don't underestimate how the Bruce beachfront property returning to the original Black owners played a role as well. You see, that was as close as we've ever seen reparations, because that's what that was. You are repairing what you broke. You took these Black people's property, now you're returning it. It's worth $30 million. That was as close as we ever got to reparations, okay? So Bruce's beachfront property, the Black Lives Matter activism and marching and protests with white and Black equally marching, and the election of Barack Obama twice said, we got to stop it. This is out of control. This is what has been the reason for Project 2025. So when we look at just the history, because all of this is history, we have affirmative action and quotas being frowned on as early as the 2000s. Keep in mind that I graduated, well, not really, I dropped out of high school in 1982. And yes, I used to have all A's before I dropped out, but then of course I spent many years out of school because I had a kid and was pregnant and couldn't go. Back then you had to wait till your kid was 18 months and potty trained to get into a daycare. And then once I could get in, I didn't know anything about a college or where to go. So I went to the community college, and it was a school counselor that said, you should apply to Ursuline College. You would do well there. And I know for a fact, that a high school dropout Black kid coming from a community college only got in because of affirmative action. So believe me, it helped a lot of us. There's no doubting that. And to say it only helped Black women is stupid, because it did help Black women, but not Black women, but white women. To say that it only helped white women is stupid. I know for a fact I benefited, and a lot of my friends did as well. So it's just that primarily white women were the beneficiaries as well, okay? Critical race theory angered whites all over this country. Not really sure why, but this was the start of where you go to the school boards and you start the banning of books, and you start saying that it's making white kids feel uncomfortable, and you start doing what Hitler did back in the 1930s. You burn the books, and then you start doing the You start doing the propaganda that Hitler did, with Fox News being an example of not news, but just propaganda, state sponsored propaganda. That's what it is. It still is. And you see the different channels popping up and all this stuff on the different channels. What is it? YouTube and Twitter and all this nonsense. Then they use the words DEI, which is sad because it's so stupid that you would use DEI as an enemy, or the new N-word, because that's what DEI is now, the new N-word. It's all over everything because it just means diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the opposite of those words is kind of scary. So the opposite of diversity is segregation, which makes sense that you would make that word a bad word, because Cheeto Puff did lift the ban off of segregation 2 weeks ago, which means federally segregation is fine. Equity. So you like the idea of us being treated unequal, because equity just means being treated equal, but now you like unequal treatment. So that's what you're supporting. Whites, I need you to hear me on this. This is crazy. And then inclusion, which is the I. Oh, now you want to exclude. So I know what that means. It means the first fired, the last hired. They're defunding the Black folks. We know that. We get it. Okay? So this is just how they're doing it. All right? Now, voter suppression. This part here is where you fuck around and find out, white folks. Yeah. You found out that because you didn't speak up when they were suppressing the vote for Blacks and browns all over this nation, primarily in the South, but a lot of the northern states as well, at least the red states, that would come and bite you in your butt when it came to this year's election. Because we saw Russia doing bomb threats in Pennsylvania, closing down voting places for an hour or two so people couldn't vote. Nobody talks about it now, but that's what Russia did. They were at this thing. They were at the root of bomb threats in Pennsylvania. You never hear anything about it. Nobody even talks about it, but look it up. When you suppress the vote, your candidate doesn't win. And when your candidate doesn't win and the bad one does, now we're getting fucked. The big lie. Many white people are just fine just ignoring that whole thing. Let's not bring it up. Let's stop talking about it. Why? It's crazy as fuck. The Capitol insurrection is still fresh in my mind. It's so crazy that that's equated to Black Lives Matter's protests. It's crazy. Here's where we kind of are really tripping. LGBTQ movement. Now, Black and brown civil rights issues with regards to racism is diluted when we threw it all together with the LGBTQ, because there were people that were starting to understand that racism was very wrong and crazy, and then you threw it and complicated it by putting the LGBTQ movement in with it. And that is where we lost support, because there were so many religious and so-called spiritual people quoting the Bible about bisexual and homosexual and all this stuff, and trans this and trans that. And every day it's a trans. Well, I got news for you. That's a winning case. So when you say DEI stands for the whole trans thing, but really we all know that the focus is racism and Black and brown people. But you put that trans on it and you got all this support nationwide. Sorry, I'm telling the truth. So much so that you ran those trans athlete commercials every day, all day, and said that Harris was paying for prisoners to get the trans surgery, just like, actually, if you look it up, so was Trump. But the racism in this country made you take someone in the name of the economy, which is trash now. In the name of the economy, the racism in this country, and the fact that white lives matter and Black and brown don't, because this guy definitely was declared as a racist. You all knew he was racist. Everybody knew he was racist, but you were comfortable with that because white lives matters and Black lives don't. You're comfortable with electing him, not not just voting for him once, but you actually voted for him to large extent in 2020. It just so happened that this time he won. But I mean, he's a convicted felon, which, you know, we talked about that. And he's a racist. But you were okay with that, white folks, because again, to you, black and brown lives don't matter as much as white lives and money, the economy. But now you fucked around and found out that he's killed our economy. And because of that, now you care and now you're marching and protesting. It just blows our minds, which is why we are not marching and protesting. The 92% is just going to sit at home and watch you do your work and pray that you keep doing it, because we can't get any of this to stop without your help. But we're just kind of saddened by the fact that you didn't give a fuck until money was involved. And you took someone who was the most qualified candidate that has ever ran for presidency, and you let her go. We probably could be having some fun right now. We could have our boots on the ground and our fans, and we could be dancing with each other and just having a great old time. But now we're just watching the stock market crash every day, and our 401ks become 201ks or maybe 01ks and cut in half. And my friend the other day lost $20,000. She's not rich, but that's what came out of her retirement. Yeah, $20,000 right off the grip, just done. Today, I don't know how much she lost. And then we're watching Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare get attacked. We didn't need to do this. We didn't. We watch veterans and folks get fired, and until you got fired, you didn't care. And then we're watching farmers lose their property. And I got news for you. That's all on purpose. It's by design. Look it up, Project 2025. I don't know if this helps, but I know you needed it. And I know blacks need it too, because we don't even know our own history. And this is why we're all here today, because of the things behind me and more. But these were the main events throughout history, the white history of America and how that impacted black and brown lives. Because at that point, white lives mattered and ours didn't. Thanks for your patience.